thank you guys all for coming. I'm Graham McKay, as most of you already know. But I'm the executive director at Lowell's Boat Shop, and this is largely going to be about Lowell's Boat Shop, not necessarily me. I am just the current, I guess, bearer of the torch there, of hundreds of others that have gone before me doing this, and we have really them to thank for it being there now. We have some people in this room to thank for it being there now. But I'm going to run you through some history first, and then we're going to talk about what we do at the shop now and really how we go about building these boats, which is vastly different from boat building that you may have learned. So we'll get to why it says wanted young man to learn trade, but essentially Lowell's Boat Shop, building boats there was a trade, not a craft as it's considered today. And when you went to work there, you were going to work as you were working in any other factory to work your trade. So I'll start you off with, I guess, familiarizing you with where we are. This is Point Shore in Amesbury, Massachusetts. People often think we're in Lowell. We are not. We are in Amesbury. The Lowell family are those that founded the shop. So Simeon Lowell is our founder, and he was practicing as a boat builder in Amesbury as early as 1774. And really where he was working is right in here. So, wait for these people to come in. So this is the Merrimack River here. This is from a 1776 chart drawn by the Brits when they were fighting with us at the time. And this is the Powell River, which runs up into the Amesbury where there's a falls. And up here you have a waterfall that powers mills, as they did in those days. One such mill was one that made nails, a nail factory. And that's what made the industry really along the river possible, was that they were producing large quantities of inexpensive nails. But Simeon, the Lowells themselves settled right in here when this was a bustling waterway, and there were shipyards and wharves and that sort of thing there. And then they later moved out to our current location, which is right in here. And when Simeon purchased that, it had a wharf and some outbuildings, but not a whole lot. He did get a house with a deal, and that is still there across the street. What was he doing? He was building, the Lowells themselves, and the town was building boats like this. This is the schooner Polly. And we are very fortunate to have this photo because the boat was built in 1805, roughly 50 years or so before photography. And this boat lasted until the 1920s even. So it was that well built that it lasted that long to be photographed. But it gives us a good picture of what they were building in Amesbury, at the turn of the 19th century. And we have old logbooks basically from the shop showing that he was working on schooners and gondolas, which is what this is, craft other than the small boats and dories that we make now. And this is that document that I was talking about, and you can see in here, because it's such a beautiful screen. Let's see, where's the little pointer guy? Maybe not. You can see in here the term wherry used quite a bit. He's selling 3 wherries, 1 wherry, and then you just see boat. So you have wherries and boats. Unfortunately, it's so long ago that we don't really know what the difference is. We presume that a boat was something that would resemble a Whitehall these days, a more refined, many planked, round bottom type boat, and a wherry was a much simplified version of that. And you can tell because, let's see, here's a 15-foot yawl, or a 20-foot boat, I guess, for $50, and a wherry is only 17. So it's at least 3 times the effort and material to make a boat versus a wherry. And the wherry is really the predecessor of the dory, which is what we became famous for and built in great numbers. This is one of the, aside from the one I just showed you, the earliest map that really shows what was happening in Amesbury. This is from 1854, and this shows the Powell River. And you've got Morrell's shop, they were boat builders, and you've got a lot of shops right along here, which is where the boat building and shipbuilding was happening. And then you can see where the Lowells moved over to here, And the interesting part about this map is that it shows us as Daniel Lowell's shipyard still. So we weren't building small boats yet. We weren't a boat shop. We were still a shipyard that was producing small boats. And you can see not necessarily so small because there is a rather sizable boat on the stocks there.
Presumably as big as the houses across the street.
Presumably as big as the houses across the street, which are, that's 50 feet long, which is not that big. So we are currently constrained quite a bit by the road in front of us and the river behind. If you go out the front door, you're in traffic, and if you go out the back door, you're in the river. And it was the same thing when they were building ships there. The ship timber was so much in the way of the road that they had to make a town ordinance that they had to maintain a clear path to get through. Again, this is the sort of thing that they were building in pre-1860. This was how fishing was done. And you were out in a boat roughly the size of the Polly that I showed you a few slides earlier. And you'd go find a fishing bank, you'd anchor the ship, and then the crew would get around the rail and start fishing for fish on the bottom. The trouble is, once you're anchored, you pretty quickly catch the fish that are right under the schooner, and then you have to take the schooner, move it somewhere else, do the whole operation all over again. They finally figured out that they could send someone out in the ship's boat a ways and search around to try to find where the fish were. Once they figured that out, they could then move the ship over there and go through the process. The guy in the small boat started to come back with a full boat of fish, and they got the idea, well, what if we just took a whole bunch of small boats out, and then we could cover a lot more ground. So what you see a lot with the fishing and overfishing in any country is that whenever the fish stocks decline, you see technology get better or you see more effort. In this case, you saw both. You saw the technology of many small boats, and that increased the effort at the same time. So catches increased dramatically, as did the income. And so in 1860, that's when the shipyard turned into a boat shop. So this is our property today. And the Lowells, when they moved down here, Simeon bought this property here and later expanded out to the west. But business expanded because Hiram developed the bank dory. People always think it's called a bank dory because they would fish on the banks, but really they were bank dories because you could bank them and then you could stack them on the deck of the schooner, like the Russian nesting dolls. And the beauty of that is you could take 16 or 18 dories out with you fishing, and they would only take up the deck space of one or two dories. And so now instead of building 2 or 3 boats for people, you were building 14, 15, 16 boats for any given schooner. And you can see, you don't often see a design over time get simplified, but that's actually what we saw with the dory. Here is our best guess of what a wherry looked like. It still has a flat bottom. The sides are rounded, but you can see there's a fair amount of shape still in the sections, and that requires a lot of planks to make that, a lot of really small planks. And then that evolved into a dory, and from the records that we have, you really see the word dory come into use in about 1817 or so. Again, we don't know what that change was from a wherry to a dory, if it was just vernacular or what it was. But the word came into the lexicon about then. And then this developed into your bank dory, where you have straight sides and a flat bottom, which allowed them to be stacked up. The other beauty about a bank dory too was that it could be mass produced. So 1861, Hiram's just getting his feet under him. He's only producing 180 dories a year, which, given the production the shop did, is not that much. Out of this, he had this shop right here, and they later added a second shop about 10 or 20 years later. When we get to 1879, you can see there are a lot of other entities building dories as well. These are all right in our neighborhood in Amesbury, which is about two blocks out here in LA. And you can see that Hiram has the most invested. He's the biggest player in the game. He's got, this is capital invested. He's got about $5,000. And the next closest guy is Edwin Morrill, but he's building carriages and wagons. He's not building dories. The rest of these guys are building dories, and you've got 3,000, 3,500. The interesting part is males above 16 years of age employed average. Hiram's only got 6. So 1879, they're still building, well, in 1879, they were probably building upwards of 12 or 1,400 boats a year with these 6 guys. Maybe he was lying on his taxes, I don't know. And then you've got number of hours in an ordinary day, May to November, which was when you had the most sunlight. They were working 10-hour days. November to May, only 9-hour days because they didn't have electricity to power the shop. So the shop is south-facing. And so this whole end of the shop is all windows because you get light to work by and you get solar heat because the shop is also not heated. And here you have, so 1871 to 1897, they're producing 885 dories a year. So, 100 dories per worker per year is pretty good production considering I can only build about 5 or 6 boats a year now. But what you see is that it is a booming business and everybody else is doing it too. This was the epicenter of dory production in this era. And so this is all basically the Lowell's holdings with a few interlopers. The Morrills were always in the way. And then down here, you've got Keniston's, Andrews is down here. And then up here, you had more Morrills and Arthur True. And these names are all still there, all over the neighborhood, all over town. It's really interesting. But the other thing you can see, if you care to look at this more closely, is you see a lot of industry along the river. You've got a hat factory here. You've got a lumber yard here. There's another hat factory there. So Amesbury had a lot of industries. This was one of them. And for a long time, this was a forgotten industry because the others were so big. And so when you're producing, in that time, close to 1,000 boats a year, they started to stack up. You can see over here, this is actually looking down at Arthur True's boat shop, but you can see stacks. There's probably about 6 dories in the stack there. And there's 4 stacks of them around the turn of the century. This is unfortunately the best picture I have of this from an old newspaper. But what you can see is stacks of dories, stacks and stacks and stacks all the way in and out from the picture. I think this was probably in March, and they couldn't get the dories out because the river was frozen, and they started to just pile up around the neighborhood. And this is one of my favorite photos. You could see better if it were in better resolution, unfortunately. But each one of these stacks is 5 dories, and there's 10 stacks on this train leaving town. And that's young Ralph Lowell there when he was just a boy. Ralph was the last Lowell to own the shop, which he sold in 1973 or 2. So how did they do it? They did it by doing it production style as a factory. So again, we think about wooden boat building now as a craft. You are building one-off boats. You're carefully selecting the wood and shaping every piece. Back then, they were trying to assemble these as quickly as they possibly could. And so when they first started to build factory style, which is something that Hiram initiated with his shop, the uppermost floor here was where they would produce the constituent pieces of the boats. You had bottoms, frames, stems, transoms, planks. Then they would come down to the assembly line, which is on the main floor where the road is. And at the front, they would take the bottom and put the frames and the stem and the transom on it. In the middle, it would be planked up. And toward the end of the shop, they would put rails on, seats in, and then they'd be lowered down to a deck and brought inside for painting. And you can see they're depicted here painting the boats with brooms. For the few of you in the room who have never been to the shop, when you go into the basement, it looks like the floor is concrete, and it's about 1.5 inches thick of just paint splatter from 150 years of paint. And interestingly enough, the main ingredient of that paint was lead. And when it's cold out, that shop holds the cold because you have basically a leaden floor that just is a heat sink for it. And also, consequently, when it's really hot, it stays very hot in the shop. And it's amazing that it's still there. I'm told there was a gentleman who just passed away this past year, but he worked there in the 30s, in the late 30s. And he said he would come in the morning, he could put his hand through the holes in the building, and he would start the wood stove, and he'd put the paint on the wood stove for about an hour to get it to become liquid. And of course, the other main ingredient was linseed oil, which is highly flammable. And the fact that it never went up is amazing, because it's also heated by wood stoves. And in the first picture I showed you of all the guys, they're all standing there with wood shavings at their feet, and a couple of them have cigars in their fingers. Just this year, we got a fire suppression system installed. So this sort of production was very much. I'll wait for them to go by. So screw up our audio.
You overdid the fire sound effects.
Yes, yeah. Seriously, they heard me talking about the linseed oil on the wood stove. So Hiram, who begot this, the other benefit of a bank story is that it's incredibly efficient on wood and incredibly easy to build, so you didn't need to employ skilled labor. The most skilled guys in this whole team were the guys putting the planks on the side. And even that, there would be a different team on each side, or so I've been told. And I have actually seen a few photographs of dories with 3 planks on one side and 4 on the other, because it didn't matter in the end. It matters with a boat that's taking turns on the sides. With a straight flaring side, you can put 6 on one side and 2 on the other. It wouldn't matter. But the planks themselves are almost dead straight when they're on the flat, so you're not wasting a lot of wood cutting funky shapes into planks. And in the end, even the frames are straight. You can build it out of straight stock, so you don't spend a lot of time hunting around for nice curved stock. They also, the shops themselves traded amongst themselves, so they would trade pieces, buy and sell pieces from one to the other. This is another great photo. This is Main Street, and there's 2 guys taking, that's called a skillet. So that's a bottom of a dory with just the frames and the stem and the transom from one shop to another. And so when one shop was slow, they might make dory pieces and sell them to the guys down the street who were busy and had an order, and vice versa. I've also, every once in a while, one of these houses will change hands along the street, and they've been lived in by the same family for 80 years. They'll find a dory pattern in the attic from someone who was making pieces at home and selling them back to the shops to make extra money. They had a baby on the way or something like that. And those luckily find their way back to the shop as well. You have to imagine, with the workforce needed and the number of dories produced, this stuff must have been everywhere in these houses. The other way they did it was, we had a number of factories downtown that I mentioned before. They were producing largely carriages. And at the turn of the century, when the dory business was really booming, the carriage industry was starting to fall off a cliff because cars were coming into use. And so the carriage factories turned some of their workers and some of the machinery over to make dory pieces, and you could actually buy pieces from downtown and then just assemble them in the boat shops. And really, that's how our peak production year was in 1911, and the shop produced 2,029 boats, which is roughly 7 a working day. And the only way you can do that is to buy all the pieces from somewhere else and put them together. And again, looking at the records we have, that was a workforce of 14 or 16 guys doing that, which is insane to think about the amount of work. And I threw this in here because what we're starting to see is, this is post-World War I, getting into the Depression, and business is starting to get a little rough. You can see this is the boat shop here. It still looks pretty good, but business is about to fall into steep decline. The other thing I like about this photo is the outhouse sticking off the back of the building over the river. And so we just, for our fire suppression system, we had to dig through this wall into the road to the water main, and that's 2 feet thick of solid rock that they built the terrace for the street up there. And this has all been filled up to the level of the street. So they put a house in 2 lots down and dug all that fill up about 2 or 3 years ago. And it was full of bottles and old signs and everything you could think of that was old pieces of car, everything that they could think of to throw in the hole. But really what's going on at this time, and I was talking earlier about when fish stocks decline, what do you see is you see technology get better. And so between the world wars, diesel engines became more available, and especially marinized, so put in boats. And I love and hate this picture, and I love this picture because it shows a particular point in time, and I hate it because it shows the decline of the dory business. So what you have here is a fishing schooner, pure sail, no engines on board, and they would be going out with a stacks of dories to go fishing right next to, I guess you'd call that an eastern rig fishing boat. Still has a mast and ability to carry sail, but you can tell by the wheelhouse, that one too, that there's an engine in it and that the sails are just secondary. And around here, they're getting a little bit more. That's got a net on the back. So these boats are starting to go the way of dragging nets versus putting guys over the side in dories. And so as a matter of course, they would always carry 1 or 2 as lifeboats, but rarely did they make it into the water. So there was still some demand for dories, but not in the numbers that they had. And in the real fishing days, when this schooner would go out with 16 dories, they might last a year or 2 of hard labor, and then they'd get retired, downgraded, and they'd have to order more dories. And just like today, we faced stiff competition from Canada, and so there were other dory factories in Canada and coastal Nova Scotia, and it was at times cheaper for the fishermen to sail from Gloucester to Nova Scotia and buy 16 dories and then head out fishing versus buying them from us.
It's kind of ironic that photo shows the power boats having all the dories.
It is ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, the schooner's got no sails on it either. I guess it's got that little cut down rig. But you see 1, 2, 3, 4 dories, a couple over here. And you can tell from this that that's a seine boat, that they're seining small fish. They're not going out for ground fish.
It's like when power shows up, it changed almost overnight on the West Coast. It was like there wasn't a long tradition of sail.
Yeah.
And they just flew away.
Because you didn't have the limitations. You could make port whenever you wanted to. In these boats too, the diesel engine took up a third of the boat. They were so big. And so you lost hold space, but you could get your fish back fresh. Whereas, you catch a summer light airs week and you're stuck there with your rotting fish on board. Not worth anything. So yes, it changed extremely quickly and was adopted. Fishermen are very quick to adopt technology, as are boat builders, by the way. So the dory itself being still the cheapest small boat you could buy, they were still built in great numbers and used everywhere. They were just used far less in the fishing industry. And I was just saying to Emily before, around about this time, you saw those boats going out on the train. We started to send boats here to Long Beach in the West Coast for use as lifeboats. And we've got records of sending boats to Africa and to developing nations because it was the cheapest, most utilitarian boat you could buy. And later on, let's see if I have anything. Well, around about this time, I tried to do better with this photo, but it got a little lost in translation. We too adapted at the shop. So we started to take our designs and adapt them to different uses. Here we took a a round-sided dory, widened it out, and put an engine in it, and we were able to sell a motorboat. But around this time too, we were shipping boats to Alaska, to the Aleutian Islands, to help fortify the islands against the Japanese invasion. Post-World War, and again, you can see that we're still building dories, but we've tried to find new markets. And so you've got, these were called punts here, a very simple little rowboat. We built these by the hundreds and thousands for Boy Scout and Girl Scout camps around the country. So, again, you're like, oh, why is anyone buying these? You still needed small boats, and we were still able to produce them, and they were still at that time all wood. And so there was plenty of market. All you had to do was adapt to figure out what people wanted and then build it. And that's what the town did as a whole. So this is all the competition. Powwow Craft, they actually started, they're 21 Cedar Street, so they were actually in a mill building that had been producing carriages. They weren't even on the river, but they were making boats and selling them through catalogs. Here's us up here. We're trying to sell little utilitarian boats that you couldn't put an outboard on. Arthur True started to build sailboats, so little small cruising sailboats, which actually, though it looks very different, if you take one apart, it's very much dory built. And then Marcus Lowell was actually the competition as well. He started to build small dories and then small sailboats. And these are only a few things that I've found in the collection, but there were, I would say, still in the 50s, there were probably a dozen or so boat builders around town building different types of boats. But again, as time marches on and fiberglass comes in, we don't adapt to that. And so the business did start to decline, and this is Malcolm Odell. So Ralph Lowell, who was the 7th generation Lowell to own the shop, sold it in the early 1970s to the Odells, and Mac Odell ran it for about 20 more years until the early 90s, at which point we became a landmark, a National Historic Landmark, and then a museum. And so I like this picture because it shows that the business wasn't able to support the building itself in its sort of rack and ruin there. And by the time the 90s rolled around, it was really in tough shape. What the Odells did do, which is, well, I'll get to the story later, but they broadened the designs that we offered. So these are all in-house designs that we still build. And what they tried to do was find markets, new markets for them. So they started to build a little rowing skiff that you could put a sliding seat in to try and get people who were interested in that in a traditional boat. Motorboats with outboards on them that go fast, little tenders for yachts, things like that. They were still trying to find that little niche market. And that's still what we do today. So what we do today as a museum is we build largely fancy little boats for people who want a thing that is really, that they can care for, and a thing that's handmade in a historic shop, and that is a thing of beauty. And so I think this boat went up to Prince Edward Island. But that is what we do. We build on average 4 or 5 boats a year, and for the most part, they are showpieces next to your utilitarian dory out there. And that is where the wooden boat market has gone. In the years that I've been, in the 10 or 12 years that I've been there, I've built 3 or 4 boats for fishermen who wanted a little boat to go fishing in, whether it be clamming or pulling a few lobster traps or that sort of thing. The rest of them have all been on the fancier side of things. And so that's our history. And now we're going to get into, because we are at the Craft in America Center, we are going to get into the trade versus the craft. And so I am here because I was in that episode industry, and I would say that I am I am celebrated, and that's my craftiest photo of myself as a craftsman. But really what I'm doing is I'm carrying on a trade, though it be a trade that has been somewhat forgotten. This guy is Aubrey Marshall, and when he was 20 years old in 1923, he answered the wanted ad that was the head slide on my show here. Whoever it was at the time, I guess it would have been Ralph or Walter Lowell, put an ad in the paper, wanted young man to learn trade. And he just moved down from Canada, was in town, saw the paper, he showed up, and for the rest of his life was a dory builder. And so that's the way it went in those days. You worked for your family, you went to work for someone in the shops, and that was basically where you stayed. And that knowledge was passed down father to son. In this case, here are 4 generations of Lowell. Here's Hiram, 1860, right on down to, I don't know if that's Marcus or Walter Lowell, and then on over to Ralph, who was the last to own the shop there on the right. And so the knowledge of how to do this and how to do it quickly and how to do it well was taught by the people who had done it. And a lot of these things weren't written down. In fact, nothing was really written down. It was just passed down, and as you know, once you've made your first 100 dories, it's pretty easy, right? So that's how it went. And then Ralph over there was an interesting fellow. I never knew him, unfortunately, but he was a Yankee, and that's sort of a term that can be endearing and also derogatory. So when Ralph sold the shop in the 70s, he sold the business, and I haven't seen the wording, though I would like to see it, to Mac Odell. But at the same time, he sold the contents of the shop to Strawberry Bank Museum. So as the Odells tell it, they showed up after the closing to build boats, and the place was empty. All the patterns were gone, even the benches were gone, everything, the tools were gone. And they went up to Strawberry Bank, which is about a half an hour away. It's a museum. And I've seen correspondence, and then Ralph went up to Strawberry Bank and started to compete with the Odells building boats up there, the same boats. So I've seen the correspondence, and Mac Odell is trying to get in to see the collection at Strawberry Bank so he can try to recreate some of these patterns so we can build these boats again. And they won't let him do it. It's a whole big fight. And it comes down to this guy. This is Fred Tarbox. And somehow as part of the sale, Fred Tarbox came with the building. more or less. You can see he looks immovable. But from memory, I'm told, he recreated the patterns and a lot of the plans, if you will, to build these boats. And so when I showed you the pictures from the 1980s of all these boats that we built, a lot of that stuff came out of Fred's memory, muscle memory really, from having done it for, his entire life. Again, you see the pipe and the shavings everywhere. I love it. And this is what is left of Fred's legacy, and this is what we have to build from now. So when I go to build, in this case, an 18-foot surf dory, this is what I dig through our little notebook to build it. No plans exist other than what I've drawn and what one kid drew in the 40s when the Navy ordered a bunch of dories and needed a drawing of what they were getting. Ralph, being a Yankee, went to the high school and found the best kid in the drafting class, and that kid came down to the shop and drew a dory. They sent that off to the Navy department, and it's completely, not completely wrong. It's got its inconsistencies, shall we say, but it didn't matter because the Navy got dories. But when you work from these, it took me some time to trust them, and I can explain to you how these work. But in essence, what you start with the bottom, and you've got a center line, and you've got a bunch of measurements out from that center line, and then a curve. And it tells you, here's your bottom, 7/8 thick, it's 13 feet long, it's 30 inches wide, at the middle, and you gotta dig in there. The frames are 26 inches apart. So 26 inches, you can get that shape, and then you've got your bottom. Now, though this be a surf dory, you go find the stem pattern for big dory, and it's dated 1982. And then you go to the collection of timbers. Let's see, we'll go back. I'll show you that later. You go to your patterns for timbers and find the ones for 18-foot swamp. Trace those out. Go to your transom. Go to 44 inches. Make it 14 inches wide. Draw a triangle. And you got a transom. So now you've got a stem, frames, transom. Your rocker. That means the bottom is bent this way. It's 3 3/8 up from 0 at the bow, and then 2.5 inches up from 0 at the stern. And this is where it gets confusing, if it's not already. With the planking, your planks are determined by widths at certain spots. So here you have one at the base of the stem, mid, forward, middle, that's the middle of the boat, and aft at the base of the transom. And this is a measurement up from the bottom. And you can see that it's imprecise, shall we say. So this is where the trade becomes a craft, and that you have to figure out how to read these, but also how to work with them to achieve what you're trying to achieve. And then invariably you run into stuff like this. Maybe wrong. And you find that, you find like little question marks next to stuff with no explanation, and you're left to try to figure it out for yourself. But the building process with one of these is exceptionally fast and exceptionally smooth. And you also are left these little nuggets of history that are just in the files, and it takes. You see all these ads that we put out in the early part of the century for haddock dories, bluefish dories, all sorts of different double dories. And before I found this, I had no idea what those really were. I still can't tell you what a bluefish dory is.
Is
but
it double? Is that the stack, the banks dory? So you have to make it smaller to fit in?
No. So the 12-footers will all fit inside each other, the 14-footers. And these are, and they still are, when you order a dory, you order it by bottom length. And you do so because the rest of it is all the same. So if you order a 12-foot dory, you're actually going to get a 16-foot boat, but your bottom is 12 feet on all the way through. And then, let's see. Anyway, you've got your little variables through here. A 36-inch bottom is a vessel dory, and this was the names that they threw around, I'm sure, in the shop, and knew exactly what they were talking about, that unfortunately have been lost to time, with the exception of this, back of the envelope sheet that we still have.
It literally is that, isn't it? It's like it's on the
Yeah.
back of a type form.
It is. It was I think a Xeroxed boat advertisement with price list, and it was written on the back in 1976. So a few years after Ralph had sold the shop, and Mac Odell was probably like, "The hell are we doing? How do we do these things?" And he scribbled this down. Luckily for us now, but these are the patterns that we have to work from to build those dories. So you've got frame patterns here, stem patterns, not shown, or bottom patterns, and basically a pattern for every part of those boats. And the curious thing about it is that from those patterns, you can build all sorts of different boats. So the Odells, when they were building for those 20-ish years, were building what they called Mr. Potato Head boats. And so they would redesign things for people all the time, and we still do now. But here's your Lowell 12-foot sailboat. For the bottom, you use a 12-foot Merrimack pattern. For the timbers, you use Swampscott dory patterns. For the stem, you use the 12-foot outboard skiff pattern. And so you just kind of make it up. The other thing that I love, and it relies on this paper being kept whole and pretty, is that you've got like here, your transom flare, right? So that's the angle of the transom to the bottom. You put your bevel gauge on the bottom of the piece of paper and up there, and that tells you what the angle is on the bottom of the transom. So on and so forth. And it's relatively foolproof. And it had to be, because that's who was building these boats for a long time. Not that they were fools, but they took all the thinking out of it, or they tried to. And then here, they took thinking out of it even more, and they made what were called dory sticks. And so all of these measurements and all of those measurements, they would put on one stick. And so all you needed was that stick to build this boat. And you could mark on the stick how far apart your stations were, and then your half breadths, your distance out from the center line. And then you could mark your lining on another side of the stick, and then with that one stick, you could walk around the shop and build that boat. And we still have a whole barrel full of these, which is about the only way that we can recreate some of the boats from before Ralph's time. And again, I talk about the artistry of it. Those patterns that we have are oversized. So you essentially make an oversized pattern and then cut a boat out of it. Here, what I'm doing, you can see, I've got a ruler, and I'm sighting down the side of the boat. Typically what will happen is you'll have the most flare in the middle part of the boat, and you'll try to cock it in as you come aft. And so you lay those out, cut them, put the plank on, go to the next one up, lay them out, cut them. And it's that part of what I would call now is the craft, for someone who is going to sail versus row, what you might do is tip these out a little bit more to give the boat a little bit more beam and a little more flare. For someone who's going to row, you might tip them in to bring the rails of the boat in so the oars aren't as long and hard to handle. It's those sorts of things that are now, that had been lost to time, and that I'm having to rediscover again. And so, unfortunately, after the Odells left, the boat builders that had been there with the Odells sort of scattered, and they were the boat builders that had learned from the old timers, and I didn't have really any crossover with them. And so that chain of knowledge was broken at that time, and I am now having to sort of figure this out from what little documentation was left and from what is around the shop. But I'm confident enough now that I can take any of these things and make them wider, longer, bigger, smaller for what people want and need. And again, the artistry is that a lot of this boat building is done by eye. So I teach a lot of classes, and my first question in the class is I ask who an engineer is, if I have any in the class, and invariably I have one or two, and I always tell them they're going to be the problem. And they're the problem because it's all done by eye, and they want to see the piece of paper with the measurement on it, which does not exist. So here what I'm doing is I'm spiling out a plank, and what matters more than anything is that these lines are nice and fair, not curvy and wonky. And you can see that what I'm trying to recreate here is the shape on the boat dictated by, this is called a batten, there. And so all of the beautiful shapes that you see on a wooden boat are dictated by how a batten curves and how wood naturally bends. When you see one of our boats with just a bottom and frames on it, it looks horrible, like an undecorated Christmas tree. Not that that looks horrible, but one without its needles, shall we say. And it's not until you wrap planks around that frame that the nice, beautiful boat shape emerges. And here are the three different ways used to achieve a boat. You've got what the engineers like, your nice little plan. You've got what we have to work with today, which are the builder's notes, what we call them. And you've got what they used for more than 100 years, these dory sticks. But any one of these is going to give you the exact same result, which is this, which is our classic bank dory. I would argue that the stick and or paper method is faster than working from a plan. Part of our mission today is perpetuating this tradition. in hopes that, I mean, I am somewhat of a tangible link to the past. What I didn't tell those of you that don't know me in the room is that I grew up within a stone's throw of the shop, and it was part of my life growing up. And so it was the backyard boat shop for me. And the people that were there, I didn't realize what they knew or what they had to offer, nor did I have the wherewithal to ask them at the time. And so since 2012, really, since the Craft in America episode, we have made it a strong part of our mission to teach youth how to do this, so that it does not get lost. Adults as well, I do a lot of adult classes. But we now run an after-school apprentice program, and these kids come in, mostly high school kids, the occasional ambitious 8th grader. And we work with them to basically to do this. And so, as we look around the shop now, we say, oh, that was an apprentice-built boat, and that was an apprentice-built boat, but we're now starting to roll them into actual work. So this past year, I guess I do payroll, sure I should know, we've had 3 or 4 of them on payroll for different things. Some of them become office helpers. Some of them become paid work. Others go on to Mass Maritime, and she's going up to work at the Wooden Boat School in Maine this summer. So at the time, you may not realize what you're teaching them or how it's affecting them, but when you see them 3, 4, 5 years out, you can see the impact on them. He's just a pain in the butt over there. In our project this year, this was taken a few days ago. This was probably taken on Tuesday, actually. We're rebuilding it's all on your seat there, the shallop for the Mayflower for Plymouth Plantation. And so one of the niches that we found that started with the whaleboat in 2012 is building or repairing replica boats for institutions like ours, nonprofits, but using it as a teaching tool for kids. So we could just rebuild this boat with professional help, and it would come out great, and it would be a beautiful thing. But if you can use this same project to teach these kids how to do it, then you've got a twofold benefit. And so this is the biggest project in my time at the shop anyway that we've seen. It's a 33-foot boat that weighs about 6 tons, and we've rebuilt the entire bottom of it. And these two guys are apprentices, and our best apprentices right now, and I hope the ones that don't see this, but our best apprentices right now are the homeschool kids, because they have the freedom to be there during the day. And so this guy, Loki's, and his brother are homeschooled, and they will show up on a Tuesday morning at 10 sometimes when they don't have anything else going on, and they'll work. And that has proven to be beneficial because they are the ones now that know best how to do stuff, and they get more responsibility. So, it's a proven method. It has been for centuries, but the way that we're trying to do it now, we are really trying to at least instill the knowledge, if not the interest and the passion in these kids. As I always say, we're not trying to make boat builders, but what we're trying to do, if our mission is to preserve and perpetuate the art and craft of wooden boat building at Lowell's Boat Shop, then this is the most obvious way to do it, is to teach these kids how to do it. And if you get a good product at the end, even better. So I finished with this. So back in the heyday of production, the Lowells maintained a warehouse on a wharf in Gloucester, and they would ship the boats down there largely over land. And across the river, the Colbys still own the farm. And when the load of dories was ready to go to Gloucester, the Lowells would hang overalls out the window, and that would let the Colbys know to hitch up the horses, and then they'd row the 5 dories across the river, well, 6 dories because they had to get back with one of them, stack them all up, and then they'd go overland on the dory train to Gloucester. I've got another picture of this same train rolling through Essex on its way to Gloucester. At this time, I'd be happy to take questions.
Curious to know when production was at its height, any sense of like what the quality of the make was? And then do you know what the oldest one in existence is?
Both good questions, and to answer it, no, because they don't last. They did not last long enough that we have a really old one. Any comment I can make on the quality would be supposition, but I have to imagine the quality was very good. And I say that you had fishermen going off a schooner miles away from it in the winter in the Atlantic, and if they saw a boat that wasn't built well, they weren't going to go overboard in it. So it was. I read in some old book once that if a dory, these guys would get lost with some regularity, but if the dory was found and the body was still in it, it was considered a good dory and would be used again. If it was found without the occupant, then it was considered a bad dory and was never again used. But they were building them very quickly, yes, but I have to think that, like anything, you get really good at it, you can build them really well. The oldest one that I know of was the one that I drew up one of those notes from it, and it was built in 1935, and it's at the reason it's still perfect is it was built and immediately went to the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, and has been in a museum collection since. Tomorrow or Saturday, I'm hoping to get down to Long Beach. They apparently have one or two dories from the 20s or 30s that have been heavily used, and they can't believe are in terribly good shape, but it'll at least tell me something.
Well, dory got sailed across the Atlantic in the 19th century, didn't it?
Howard Blackburn?
That sounds right.
Yeah. I think it had a deck on it though. But
yes. I think he,
but a couple of people have done it, rowed across the ocean in dories, which is again, it's a wonderful boat for going out and fishing.
It's a lifestyle choice.
Yes, exactly. For actually rowing, you've got that much flat bottom boat in the water and that much above, and so if it starts to blow, you just blow sideways. And it's not until you load that up with a whole lot of weight and it gets down that it starts to act like a boat. And again, they didn't have a skeg on them, so like a surfboard has a skeg that comes down that keeps you pointed straight. These did not have skegs because that wouldn't allow them to be stacked. And it's that skeg that when you're rowing helps keep you going straight. So these tend to kind of wander around when they're light. But I'm guessing you'd be pretty rugged after a row across the Atlantic.
What was the shape of the shop when you started working there?
Much better than in the 70s. So in the 90s, luckily I think the worst year was we built a boat, which maintained the continuous production since 1793. And that was in that early 90s period because the Odells actually sold the shop to the Trust for Public Lands, which was a non-federal entity. Earmuffs. And the feds couldn't own it because it's a Superfund site because it's got lead paint everywhere. And if it was going to be federally owned, they'd have to remediate it, which would essentially erase all of the interesting history. In the shop, photographers love it because it's textured, and that you walk in, there's not a wall that's not covered with stuff, and there's just stuff everywhere. So in the 90s when that happened, the Trust for Public Lands then had a federal grant and did a lot of work to take care of many of the structural issues that had happened, or that had, deferred maintenance had allowed to happen over time, and then the shop was lightly used for the next 20 years until about 10 years ago. And the shop was reformed under a new umbrella, a new nonprofit at that point. And since then, we've been using the shop quite hard, actually, in that it's extremely busy, and that has that made evident some other issues that weren't addressed then. In this past year, we were able to raise $500,000 to rework some of the foundations, do some structural work to some of the interior beams in the shop, and put in a fire suppression system, which I mentioned earlier. In the spring, we will get a new roof, and then we'll be almost as good as new, without erasing any history.
Just in terms of the way you build the boats, the shop, the heart, the tooling you use, the benches, are you trying to replicate a particular, you said that it was clean when the Odets came in.
Yeah.
Are there any benches or anything?
So a lot of that stuff dates to the Odell's time. So the benches and everything are all from the mid-70s. And we are a museum, and as a museum, you tend to try to depict a snapshot in time, but we're a working museum that has never stopped working. And so I was saying to someone earlier that we had a group from Winterthur, which is a super preservation-minded, conservation-minded organization. And I was showing them around and how I build, and I grabbed an iron that's got an accession number on it and used it to bang a rivet. And they were all, it's the same thing. It's, the guy was using it yesterday for the same thing, and the guy was using it the day before and the day before that. So, you're not changing anything by using it. And the fact that we are using the shop hard means that, you can't have a static museum that depicts a moment in time. And we also have to be able to adapt with the market. And we use some composite materials now. We still build wooden boats, but we'll use fiberglass and epoxy to make them trailerable and not prone to the leaking and swelling that you get with a regular wooden boat. And we even, right now on the building bed is a boat where the bottom and the garter, the first plank, are made out of Corcel, which is like a foam sandwiched between fiberglass, again, earmuffs. And the idea behind that is it's got built-in flotation. And this boat that I'm building is for a guy with a young family down in Florida, and he wants to take it out to like reefs that are 2 or 3 miles offshore to go snorkeling with the kids and do that kind of thing. And I don't want to send him a boat that's lacking in flotation. So this is something that we're experimenting with now, and then we'll put a wooden boat. The first plank will be that Corcel, and then it'll be wooden and traditional above. So everything will look exactly like a traditional wooden boat. It will just have some hidden composite flotation in it. But again, the shop, if the shop did not adapt after the dory demand went away, then it wouldn't be here today. So it's always an interesting line of where the museum starts and stops, because we do have a static museum in the basement of our history, but also how much can you change the designs and the product. And I always fall back on the answer is, if nobody wants the old product, then you've got to change it to build something that people do want. And if the demand completely dries up because we haven't adapted, then we're not fulfilling the mission.
What do you see how do you foresee the future of Lowell? Is it going to be more educational, production, restoration? What's the next 50 years look like?
Also a good question. The next 50 years, I think, should look like the present, in that I've been there long enough now that I've seen dips and rises in the demand. But what I am seeing now is we are establishing this niche of building these traditional boats for other institutions. So in the coming years, next winter, I've almost closed the deal to work with kids from a school half an hour away to build 2 life-saving surf dories for a life-saving station that's just been restored and needs boats. And then in this coming years, I'm looking at, there are 2 original Gloucester fishing schooners that are currently or are to be rebuilt, and working or trying to get the contract basically to build traditional dories for those, using again the apprentices and teaching them how to do it, building dories for those boats. And so if you look, the demand is out there, but what I have seen, especially with the repair work, is that, and I was on the phone earlier with a guy today who says you can't find this stuff anymore. And when I was a kid, even when we were kids, there were 3 or 4 guys, maybe 5 guys around. If you had a wooden boat with a broken plank, you could take it to and they could fix it. And now between Gloucester and Portland, Maine, there are maybe 3 or 4 or 5 guys like that. And so we're seeing that sort of business because there's nobody around that does that anymore. And we're also seeing the market open up because there's the internet. So I'm making a boat to go to Florida, and I've got another boat that's going to West Virginia maybe, and I sent a boat to Oklahoma last year. So that kind of market has opened up because of the internet. But the local market is, I think, these small boats, and a lot of what we work on are heirlooms. There's a boat in the shop right now that was built in the 20s or 30s that is being rebuilt to be passed on to its 4th generation. So I don't think those are going to completely go away.
Is there water in Oklahoma?
There's a lake that's very similar to the Venice canals.
Where the contents of Lowell's ended up over the years after that, did any of it make its way back?
Yes, I didn't cover that. So in the mid-90s, much of that came back. Unfortunately, so after 200 years of building boats, you can imagine the stuff that had collected. And so when it went to Strawberry Bank, the capacity wasn't there to house it all. So I'm told that like the old original benches sat outside for a time and then eventually disintegrated. A lot of the patterns did survive, and until recently we haven't had the money to pay somebody or the volunteer power, I guess, to catalog what we had. So we didn't even know what we had. I don't think Ralph knew what went, and then when it came back, we didn't know what came back. So it's hard to tell what got lost, but a lot did come back, and in recent years, we've been able to catalog a lot of that. And I've just gotten an order for a 12-foot dory, which is a 16-foot boat, and I can now go into the catalog and I can find the pattern from the 30s or 40s and pull that out, and I can find the frame pattern and the stem pattern for all that stuff. So yeah, it's really great to be able to use these patterns. I actually, when I went and measured that boat in Virginia at the Mariners Museum, and I came back with the measurements, I could use those to then go find the pattern that was used to make it. And it was perfect, measured up perfectly. So
a lot of the how-tos were kind of lost to time, and some of them sounds like they've come back. Do you feel any responsibility to lock down some of what you're learning? Like,
that's what I'm trying to do here.
Or with your apprentices, I mean, actually, like, have something to hand to someone at the end of the day. And
yes.
Boat building.
What they're going to get is boat building as I know it,
Right.
which I guess is better than boat building than someone who has not done it. But I think what got lost to time was the nuance. And I know Freddie Tarbox could show me a really easy way to do this or that I struggle with because he'd done it 1,000 times. Even now, when I go to build a boat, or if I say it still, there are corners of the shop that I have not seen because there's so much stuff in there. But every once in a while, when I'm moving something, I'll find a pattern, and with my experience now, I'll understand what that is, and I'll be like, oh God, I spent 4 hours making this thing and I could have just traced it. And that stuff is all over the shop still, and a lot of it doesn't look like patterns. You wouldn't know it was a pattern for a certain part unless you had to make it. And I'm militant about keeping people from throwing things out. So just around the corner from us, there was a boat shop that had been purchased after the owner, Percival Andrews, passed away. Had been kept in the same family since, I think it was 1969 or something. The same family had owned it, still owns it now. But when I talked to him, it must have been when I was out of the country, he said he'd thrown 2 or 3 dumpsters of stuff out from the boat shop, and I can't imagine what was in there that is now just in a dump, because it didn't look like anything, It just looks like scraps of wood if you don't know what you're looking for. So to answer your question, yes, I've written a few articles explaining how to do it. I've taught, at this point, I would say the number of students I've taught is in the several hundreds. Not necessarily this method, but you got to start with baby steps. And the professional boat builders that I work with, I'm certainly teaching. But as far as writing it down, it's hard. It's a hard thing to write down because you don't know you know it until you do it. And then you don't know what it is specifically to tell somebody else to do other than generalities,
Almost
which
like
is really all I got.
Oral history, physical history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's taken me, till really a few years ago to know, there are a few variables that you can mess with. And one of those little sheets that I showed you, one of them has written on it, alter plank lining at your own peril. So if you screw with any of those things, the rest of nothing else falls into place. And as you build, it all builds on top of what went before. So if you alter something in step 1, you're going to find it in step 4, and you're going to have to put a shim or a patch or something. And I've done enough of that to know what you can do where. Okay, thank you guys for coming.